don't know if they're talking. Ma'am, can we get Spanish?
All right, so we just learned some more about this suspect, 29-year-old Omar Siddiqui Mateen, including the interviews he actually had with the FBI in connection with investigations. Apparently, he had made some sympathetic comments about ISIS that generated the initial interviews. He was interviewed, but they found no conclusive evidence. They said it was inconclusive as to any specific solidarity or sympathy, support, involvement with ISIS. They did tell us, though, that on this 911 call that he made into this terror operation, he did express his support for, quote, the leader of the Islamic State. Peter Bergen, he also mentioned specifically the case of Manar Abu Salah back in 2014, an American who went to Syria for ISIS.
Well, this is fascinating that the FBI would be investigating Mateen for his connections to Manar Abu Salah. Manar Abu Salah was recruited by Al-Qaeda in Syria, the local group there. It's known as the Nusra Front. He traveled from Florida to Syria, got training, then came back to Florida, unbeknownst to the FBI until later, met with a number of people, and then went back to Syria again to conduct a suicide operation for Al-Qaeda. So the fact that this guy, Mateen, seemed to have been, you know, in the social circle of Manar Abu Salah, who's also a Floridian, who was recruited by Al-Qaeda, you know, I think is, you know, quite significant.
Now, tell us why you think it's quite significant, because the FBI concluded it was inconclusive.
Well, this is the only example of an American citizen recruited by Al-Qaeda going to Syria conduct a suicide operation. I mean, this guy was the real deal. So the fact that the FBI was looking into who was in this guy's social circle. Now, they may have concluded that Mateen, the perpetrator of the Orlando attack, was merely an acquaintance. But the fact is that they were in Florida together. They were obviously had some kind of connection, and Manar Abu Salah is an Al-Qaeda suicide bomber, the first American to conduct suicide in Syria.
Art Roderick, you used to work for the U.S. Marshal's office. It sounds very, very awful that someone like this was working for a security firm that had federal contracts for almost 9 years, was investigated several times by the FBI in connection with allegations he was sympathetic to ISIS, expressing support for Islamist terrorism, if you will, and then within the last week or two goes out and buys guns that wind up killing 50 people and injuring another 50 plus.
Yeah, I think the normal person out there would think that all these dots would be connected. Unfortunately, that's not the case. These systems still don't talk to one another very well, especially the no-fly list as compared to an individual purchasing a handgun. And I know there's a lot of political issues involved in that, but I think right now the Bureau is probably re-looking at how they conduct these interviews, what the targets are, who the individuals are associating with. And it is very disturbing that this individual not only had associations that were being investigated, but also worked for a company that had federal contracts, could have been at airports, federal buildings, and it was also allowed to purchase firearms to commit this horrible crime.
Paul Cruikshank, you heard what the Florida senators, Bill Nelson and Marco Rubio, said, that there are these reports that ISIS is now claiming responsibility. I know you're checking into that. We haven't confirmed that. What are you hearing?
Wolf, what we can say is there is an ISIS-affiliated news agency called the Amaq News Agency that on its official Telegram channel put out a statement saying that a source had told them that the person who carried out this attack overnight in Florida was an ISIS fighter. This is not an official ISIS claim, but this is a claim from a news agency very closely affiliated with the terrorist group in Syria and Iraq. There were a number of things which were perhaps a little bit strange about the statement. According to our own CNN translators, they used the Arabic word for gay rather than a much more abusive epithet that they have used in the past. But generally, the Amaq News Agency has put out statements which are less abusive in tone than ISIS itself. So this was put out, according to Flashpoint Partners, a organization tracking these things, on the official Telegram channel, a social media channel of Amaq News Agency. So this is not an official claim of responsibility by ISIS. It is not ISIS saying that they directed this, but the news agency saying they have a source saying this man was an ISIS fighter, Wolf.
Kimberly Dozier, you're checking into this. You're working your sources on all of this. It is pretty alarming, obviously. This is the worst mass shooting in American history. What are you hearing?
Well, still no word, as Paul said, on whether this was ISIS directed, but it does fit right into ISIS's playbook in places like Iraq and Syria. When they start losing on the battlefield, they attack in civilian areas. We've seen a rise in car bombings in Baghdad and in Damascus. And what we see on the battlefield is ISIS is under pressure on several fronts. The town of Fallujah within Iraq is being encroached upon by Iraqi forces. They may be about to lose Manbij. That's a town near the Turkish border inside Syria. If they lose that, that is being encircled right now by U.S.-backed rebel forces. They lose their ability to traffic people and supplies over the Turkish border. Then in Raqqa, their de facto capital, they've got U.S.-backed rebels approaching on one side and Russian-backed Syrian forces approaching on another. And just one more place they're losing, in Libya, the UN-backed Libyan forces there, who are also getting help from U.S. Special Operations Forces, are approaching Sirte. And it looks like that the ISIS fighters, thousands inside that city, might soon flee. So what you've seen in the past is whenever they're under siege, they want to distract their followers and make it look like they're powerful by attacking somewhere else. Fortunately, U.S. officials thought it would be perhaps an attempt on the soccer tournaments going on in France. Instead, it was in our borders.
I want to bring back Art Roderick. Art, with this investigation, I assume they're spending an enormous amount of time, even as we speak right now, going through his social media, going through his computers, going through all of his records, trying to find out, A, if anyone else was involved.
Yeah, Wolf, the JTTF probably is the backbone of this type of investigation. And the JTTF is comprised of just about all federal investigative agencies.
That's the Joint Terrorism Task Force.
Correct, and there's about 71 of them around the country, and I'm sure they're all scrubbing their books now to find out what connections this individual had. But they've got a lot of resources at their ability. You heard the president mention that all federal resources are available, so you've got the full weight of all federal law enforcement agencies with the bureau in charge coming down on this particular case.
It's interesting, Peter, we've been looking at this statement put out by the Amaq news agency, this ISIS affiliate so-called news agency, and we've translated, CNN has translated it. I'll read it to our viewers. The armed attack that targeted a gay nightclub in the city of Orlando in the American state of Florida and that bore more than 100 killed and wounded was carried out by an Islamic State fighter. Now, our experts who have reviewed the Arabic translation, they point out, as Paul Cruikshank just did, the language is inconsistent with previous ISIS announcements. In particular, the Arabic word for gay was used rather than an epithet, the usual approach that ISIS uses when they talk about the gay community. There was no claim the attack was directed, just an after-the-fact claim that the gunman was an ISIS fighter. You've looked at this carefully, Peter. You've studied this over the years. What's your analysis?
I think it's very unsurprising that this looks like an after-the-fact claiming of this attack. There is no evidence that this guy was trained by ISIS. There is no evidence yet that he was directed, perhaps over encrypted communication, to do anything, although that maybe that will emerge. But the fact is that this seems to be an after-the-fact embracing of this attack. This is something that ISIS has been trying to do, inspiring people around the West to just carry out attacks. They don't need formal training. And this is the pattern that we've seen in this country, Wolf, where people are not getting training by ISIS in Syria, as we saw in Paris or in Brussels, where people were, these were ISIS-directed, owned, financed operations. We're seeing something that is quite different here in this country.
And Paul Cruikshank, I'm going to show our viewers another picture that we just received of this terrorist, Omar Siddiqui Mateen. There he is over there. Another picture of this terrorist who killed 50 people at this gay bar, this nightclub, injured at least another 50 people. The FBI agent in charge that we just heard from referred to that case, and we heard we heard Peter Bergen discuss it. Monir Abu Salah, this other American who from Florida, who went to Syria, became a suicide bomber. The FBI investigated Mr. Mateen as a result of his so-called minimal contact with Abu Salah. But they didn't think it was significant. It was inconclusive in their words. It sounds pretty stark to me, though.
Well, there'll certainly be questions asked, as Peter Bergen was alluding to, about this investigation. Monir Abu Salah became the first American suicide bomber in Syria for Al-Qaeda, the Al-Qaeda affiliate Jabhat al-Nusra, in May 2014, blowing himself up in Syria. As Peter was talking about, he actually came back to Florida for a period of time, even after he'd spent some time in Syria, both men from Florida. But at the same time, it's got to be stressed that the FBI are conducting an awful lot of terrorism investigations right now. They have opened 1,000 cases into suspected radical extremists in the United States. 800 of those cases, there's some kind of link to ISIS in terms of sympathy. So they are stretched quite thin right now, the FBI, in terms of everything that they have to look out for. One extra point here is that over the last 7-8 months, there has been a real drop in the number of Americans who have been attempting to try to travel to Syria and Iraq. Up till August 2015, according to the FBI director, 6 to 10 Americans were trying to go every month. That's now fallen to about 1. But the worry has been that, frustrated in their attempts to travel to Syria and Iraq, that they would launch attacks back home. And that's exactly what Abu Muhammad al-Adnani, the ISIS spokesman and senior leader, called for on May 21, just a few days ago, for attacks during Ramadan and for Americans to stay home and launch terrorism attacks against civilians.
All right, stand by. Victor Blackwell is on the scene for us in Orlando. Victor, you're